Hello everybody, I am open up to the lecture slides for chapter 8, and again I'm going to be doing these short lecture bursts on various topics within chapter 8. So this first one deals with social norms as a part of social influence. So we usually start out talking about social norms because a lot of what drives us in society are norms of our culture and how we should behave. So they play a big role in influencing our behavior. So let's move through some of these to start. Social norms tell us a lot. They are patterns of behavior that we accept as normal in our culture. So individuals are expected to conform to norms. They're like rules that govern our behavior. And those can be explicit or implicit. The first type of norm that we talk about would be a descriptive norm. This is what most people would do under certain circumstances. So given a certain situation, what would most people do? That's interesting and informative because if most people do the same thing, then they've learned in society and in their culture that that's what we do. They've learned it and adopted it as a pattern of behavior that is indicative of the society that they live in. So we kind of can predict, usually, what most people will do given certain circumstances. Those are descriptive norms. An explicit norm is something that's very explicitly stated, very clear, like parking in a handicap space. This is explicit because it is a norm that we know we shouldn't do. Handicap spaces are reserved for handicapped individuals, and they're clearly marked with a sign. And so we know in our culture not to do that. However, people do. So most people comply to this norm, not all do. Some take their chances and park there anyways, and the ramification could be getting a ticket. So that would be the consequence of defying that explicit descriptive norm. Implicit norms are ones that are kind of underwritten, like people don't really necessarily always comply to them, and they're not explicitly stated. So they're not necessarily laws or rules, but they do govern our behavior nonetheless. So a good example of this would be showing up fashionably late to a party. Everybody kind of knows it's okay to be fashionably late, even maybe preferable to being on time. No one wants to be the first person to show up at a party necessarily. So this is sort of like an implicit norm. We all kind of know this in our culture, and it's accepted as okay. However, if you were from another culture or another country and you came here, you might not know that. It's not stated anywhere. It's not on a sign. It's not a law. It's just kind of what people in our culture do. So you'd have to give it some time being in this country to understand how that operates. These are all very powerful influences on our behavior, and most people do adhere to them, but again, not always. And so one of the questions we ask is what would happen if someone didn't adhere to an implicit norm? Okay? Since implicit norms aren't necessarily against the law, like parking in a handicap space, they're kind of things people do that they know they really shouldn't. What would be the consequence, right? I mean, you wouldn't get a ticket, you would for showing up late to a party or not. But maybe you might get ousted from a social group, or you might be considered not cool. So there would be consequences, but those consequences would differ perhaps from those that would follow if you broke an explicit descriptive norm. Injunctive norms refer to what is approved or disapproved behavior in different circumstances. So these refer to what we should do in certain situations. And they really need to be personally relevant, where descriptive norms are maybe how people might act in a group. Injunctive norms are perceptions of what behaviors are or are not acceptable. And these can be quite powerful, but sometimes ignored. And again, the more personally relevant they are, the more a person is going to follow them. And injunctive norms we'll take a look at in a minute. I'll give you some more examples. We also have situational norms, and these can be things that are specific to particular situations, okay? Like lowering your voice in a library. Everyone kind of knows that that's the norm of what you do when you enter a library, even though maybe there's no law against it. So it's kind of like a descriptive norm. Most people will adhere to it. And so we know that in our culture. Remember when we talked about a person's behavior at a funeral versus in Vegas, right? Depending upon the situation, we are free or not free to act in certain ways. And so our behavior is going to follow suit. Sometimes situational norms can suppress our attitudes or enhance our attitudes. So we talked about that when we covered the chapter on attitudes. Given a certain situational norms, you may or may not state your attitude or let others know what your attitude is about something. It just depends on how comfortable you are or who you're around, whether or not your attitude is going to be enhanced, like at Vegas, or suppressed, like in a funeral. So norms can vary from culture to culture. Normative focus theory proposes that norms will have an influence on our behavior, but only if they're personally relevant. So this is really different from culture to culture. Social norms dictate many areas of our lives. Even the ways in which we greet one another can vary greatly from culture to culture. And so injunctive norms, and for the most part, descriptive norms, might change over time as culture changes. They change with culture. We find littering like this really kind of outdated. These used to be signs that were posted in the subway back in the 50s when littering was a thing. People would litter all the time and no one thought anything of it. But today, that's not the case. We've now created a new norm for littering, whereas you don't do it. And you could even get fined if you do it. So it's actually become a very explicit descriptive norm. And so while it used to be the injunctive norm that we shouldn't litter, most people followed the descriptive norm, which was kind of, well, we do litter because that's just what we do. And so to change this, they had to post these billboards and kind of get people used to seeing this, like, hey, it's not nice for you, it's not nice for us, we don't want to do this to the environment. So really what they were doing, public service announcements like this were doing, was trying to change people's view of what the norm is and get people to think of littering as not the norm now. Okay, so that's how norms can change over time, but it takes effort in order to do this. Why is it so hard to get students to ask questions in class? Remember pluralistic ignorance? Thinking everyone knows what's going on even though they often don't? The norm in class has kind of become to not ask questions. Even when you don't understand, you don't want to be that one person to raise your hand. But what if the teacher created an atmosphere where the norm is to ask questions, right? That would be a very different classroom environment, and the situation might dictate that you do it in one class but not in another. So pluralistic ignorance is sort of a norm. It's going along with what is perceived by the individual to be the norm, even if it isn't really the norm. And people publicly accept social norms out of the desire to be accepted. But they don't really always necessarily agree with those norms privately. So there's public acceptance of a norm, and then what is your privately held belief in reference to the norm. And those two don't always mesh up. I posted a video for you guys about what happens when someone breaks a social norm. It's the Free Hugs campaign. So you're going to want to watch that and see that and just be thinking about what are people's reactions to this guy breaking a social norm. He's out in the commonplace, marketplace, streets asking people for hugs. That's not normal. We don't usually see that happening day to day. So what are people's reactions to him? And how do those reactions change over the course of the video? So that's going to complete this lecture burst on social norms. In the next one, we're going to get into conformity.